Hi all, thanks so much for joining today. My name is Dana Flightman. I am the Training and Awareness Specialist at SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. It's great to see folks introducing themselves in the chat. I'm seeing different disciplines from all across the country, including some of you for whom it's very early, like 8 a.m., which to me is too early to join a webinar, or very late. I saw someone in Guam at 1 a.m. So thanks for watching this even at the wee hours. Definitely appreciate you joining and learning a little bit more about stalking today. So as you may know, stalking is one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, but it's always kind of like and stalking, like we almost called our website andstalking.org, because so often it's an afterthought in our field, and we're primarily focused often in our agencies on those other victimizations, right? But the reality is that stalking is prevalent, and it's something that the victims and survivors you're working with are definitely experiencing, but it's not always recognized at the same level. And we also tend to be, just as a field, really undertrained on stalking. So I'm curious, you can let me know, is this the first time, and I'll launch this poll here, have you ever had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking? So you can say, hey, it's my first one, maybe, yeah, 1 or 2, or God, I could teach this. I don't know why I'm listening to you, Dana. And of course, we all bring a lot of expertise to this, to this call. You're the ones on the ground doing the work. So never hesitate to share an example, a lesson learned, a challenge, anything in the chat, because it's always great to hear what's going on the ground. All right, I'm going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let me share results. Okay, so we have kind of a mix here. Over half of folks are saying, hey, it's my first stalking training. About a quarter have been to maybe 1 or 2, and less than a fifth saying, oh, I've been to a bunch of these. And so, this is not a critique of anyone and their work, but it is a comment on, we're really undertrained on stalking. And this is pretty typical. I do this training all across the country for audiences, including law enforcement, victim services, campuses, mental health, prosecutors, corrections, variety of folks, and usually half to the whole room haven't been able to attend a training on stalking before. And look, you're the ones doing this work on the ground every day. You know how to do what you do. My hope is just by the end of this training, you'll kind of move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of your sentence and see the great work that you're already doing through that lens. So SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking. And our website, we did not go with andstalking.org. We're at stalkingawareness.org, where we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have for campus professionals, for law enforcement, for victim services, for prosecutors, for corrections, for judicial officers. We also have training modules. So if you do any kind of public awareness education or campus prevention education around dating abuse or sexual assault, we want you talking stalking as well, right? And so we have scripted, ready-to-use programs that can help you integrate stalking into your existing programs or lead a standalone. We have discussion guides on the show You. We have activities and other ways that videos and ways to easily start doing that stalking education where you are without having to reinvent the wheel. We are not a direct service provider, but victims do come to our website for information. So we provide informational resources like infographics, fact sheets, and guidance on where to go, as well as some general safety planning advice and webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck, because we have an archive of recorded webinars, and we're called SPARC, so I got us to call it the SPARchive. So that was pretty much the pinnacle of my career. So you can check us out in the SPARchives, and this webinar is posted there. Ooh, it looks like my camera just went and I don't know why. Okay. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC, we won't be scared. We won't report you. We want you to follow us. Please do. We're asking. It's consensual. And sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking agency, we won't contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt into our newsletter. we only send it around quarterly. It's not one you're getting all the time. And it's a great way to stay updated on our resources. So I hope you will connect with us after the session. All right, so why learn about stalking besides, okay, it's one of the 4 crimes and this webinar is being offered? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and US territories. It's a crime on tribal lands and in the military justice system. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction or the situation, but it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is criminal, usually whether it intersects with physical violence directly or not. And so, of course, a lot goes into a victim's decision to call law enforcement or not, but a lot of them don't even know if that's an option because they don't recognize what's going on is a crime that could be. And stalking is traumatic. So often when I hear stalking mentioned, folks go right to the co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that's important. I'm going to talk about it in like 2 slides. But I want to pause here and point out that even if the stalking, again, in no way intersects with physical violence, it's a crime in its own right because it is deeply traumatic for victims and survivors. So many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. And if you think about what we call that anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And maybe you've had that in your life. Maybe you've waited for an important call from the hospital or an email about something really high stakes. And it's kind of that sense of any second something could happen. And it could be good, it could be really bad. You have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. And so you can imagine how traumatic that would be, both short and long term potentially, and the kind of hypervigilance that that could result in. Many lose time from work. 1 in 8 lose some time from work. About half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking victims are typically not a protected class of worker. And so in other words, if a stalking survivor goes to their supervisor and says, hey, here's what's going on, can we switch shifts or not answer the front desk phone? The supervisor can be accommodating, or they can say, that's inconvenient, you're fired. And that typically they won't have a recourse there, right? And so we see victims losing their jobs because of that lack of accommodation, as well as, of course, interference from the stalker, right? They're parked outside the restaurant, I'm not gonna go in and work my shift. They slash my tires, I can't get to work, right? So that kind of interference. And many relocate. So this really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about moving and it's all a positive thing, it's still something that's expensive, it's stressful. It's not something you do because you're kind of annoyed by something, right? It's a big life change. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims moving to get away from these offenders. And I think that helps to illustrate how traumatic and consuming this victimization can be. It's always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And I like this quote because it is illustrative of what so many survivors have said to me, the sense that it's never really over, that I knew the day, probation or parole ended, they'd call me, and they did. That, oh, they can always come back. And so rather than a traumatic event you can heal from, the trauma is ongoing, and there's victimization that can always recur and happen and pop up again. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to penetrative rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed as, oh, it's just texting, it's leaving packages, it's following, no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher that we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. Is the different behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time, not always right in a straight line. You know, there might be periods of dormancy. There might be, oh, they were in person, now they're just texting, maybe they're backing off. But now they're back doing something else and overall escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide or extreme violence. That's not accurate, right? What I am saying is that every week I read cases of violence, homicide, attempted violence, attempted homicide. And at that point, responders are looking back and saying, oh, look, there was this whole history of stalking victimization. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not addressed with the urgency that it needed. And we don't want that, right? We don't want to wait for violence and look backwards and say, oh, look, I guess there was stalking all along, right? We want to identify the stalking while it's going on. And this is one of the few victimizations that really gives us that opportunity, because stalking is one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can help prevent trauma, violence, and possibly even death. But it's really underreported. So similar to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, fewer than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement. Campus study showed fewer than a third reporting to any sort of service, whether that was campus security, Title IX office, anybody. So if you could tell me in the chat, why? Why do you think that is? Why would a stalking victim not pick up the phone and call law enforcement, campus security, or any authority figure the moment that they start thinking, I'm getting kind of freaked out here? Why? So you're seeing not believed. Yeah, they might be afraid that the responder won't believe them. And we often see that, right? This sense of, I can't prove it. And a lot of stalking behaviors are contextual and personal in nature. I'll talk about that more in a second. So they can be hard to prove. Oh, they came by, but they left. I didn't film it. So what's the point of even calling, right? Minimizing. Yeah, there might be afraid that the responder will minimize it, right? They'll be told they're overreacting, or that it's not a big deal, or that they should be flattered or something like that. And we also see a lot of minimization on behalf of that the victim does themselves, right? That sense of, I don't want to make it a big deal. Maybe I'm overreacting. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. I can handle it. I don't want to make it a whole thing, right? So we get that minimization from responders, that fear of minimization, as well as that minimization from our victims themselves. Someone said out of fear of escalation too, right? So we know that when a victim reports to law enforcement or a protective order served, that can absolutely escalate their risk, right? And that stalker might escalate their behavior to punish the victim for doing that. And so it might be not safe for them to report it, or they might be afraid of that retaliation. I'm just looking through your answers here because you have so many good ones. Not realizing how dangerous, yeah, that minimization, hard to prove. Distrust of system, absolutely. They may just feel that, maybe they've had a negative experience with law enforcement, maybe a friend has, maybe they're from a marginalized community, they just want to go to law enforcement. They just don't think that they'll be helpful. And so I'm saying they don't realize it's a crime. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. A lot of people don't even realize I could do this, or that that's an option to consider, right? Someone else saying it's been normalized. Absolutely. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But we hear the word stalking in daily conversation, most of us, right? Like, oh my God, I was stalking you on Insta. When we're not really talking about stalking. And we see it normalized and romanticized in our media quite a bit. And so it can make it hard to differentiate. And also, even if a victim is feeling afraid, they might feel like, but is it me because I've seen this and it's been cute, right? And so they don't know it's scary. Yeah, so I think all of these questions, right? They feel the response, all these responses, right? They don't think they'll be believed. They can't prove it. They're afraid of escalation. They're minimizing it. They're afraid of others minimizing it. But let's say they do report it. So this was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence. About 300 involve clear documented evidence of stalking. So like we're all saying, that doesn't always happen, right? Not always reported. And when it is reported, hard to prove. But we have 298 cases of documented stalking here in law enforcement hands. How many cases do you think were charged as stalking? It was one. Only one case actually got a stalking charge. And look, a lot goes into charging decisions. You want to be strategic, of course, I understand that. But the reality is these offenders, this crime is not being identified. And we see this across the board in multiple studies showing, there's this chunk of stalking cases and they're not being named as stalking. And so it's not being identified always by our victims, but even when it is in the responders' hands, both on the criminal justice side and on the victim services side, this is not always being identified or named as stalking. Victims are not necessarily getting the specialized safety planning that they need or connection to resources. And the offenders are not being charged with this and held accountable like they should be. But it's okay, we're gonna fix it today. So today I'm gonna talk about what is stalking, the diversity of stalking behaviors, dynamics of stalking. I'll briefly touch on the intersection of stalking with intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and then I'll give you some big picture tips on responding to victims. So I keep saying stalking so bad, we have to do something. Okay, well, what is it exactly? Well, there's your behavioral definition and your statute. Every state has a different stalking statute to make it fun. And so I'm really excited because we just added on our website, and my colleague Emma McDonald's on the call and will share with you in the chat a link to this, an interactive map where you can find your stalking statute as well as some interpretation of it from our attorneys at Equitas, which SPARC's a project of Equitas. And so definitely encourage you to look at your statute. And if you want someone to talk through the differences between the behavioral definition and your statute, happy to do that and or connect you with our attorneys. And that's important because you might be realizing that, hey, I'm working with a victim. This is definitely stalking behavior, but maybe your statute's narrow. You can't charge stalking, but it's stalking. Okay, in that case, we still want to identify that risk, right? And help that victim. And then maybe we're thinking about charging something else, but you want to be able to explain to the victim, this is stalking though, right? And have that risk profile, et cetera. And so it's good to know the differences. But today, since we have a national audience, and since you can go rogue and look at the website yourself, which Emma's going to share in just a second. I'm going to really focus on the behavioral definition today. For any campus folks, that's the same as our clarity and Title IX. So any student policy will pretty much use this behavioral definition. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and all these scenarios, all of them are bummers. We don't like them. But which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. So I'm going to bring them up as polls for you. So this first scenario, let's see. Okay. A student peeks in the women's locker room to watch the women in their undress. Does this sound like stalking to you? And I'm making you say yes or no. You can't say maybe or it depends because I'm very mean. So I'm making you choose. All right, I'm seeing the votes come in. I'm shutting it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, splitting the room here. Most folks saying no, but about a quarter saying, yeah, that could be stalking. Okay, next scenario. An ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Could this be stalking? Yes or no? Give you a few more seconds. All right, shutting it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, again, splitting the room, but about, about 2/3 saying, yeah, that's stalking, and about a third saying, more than a third saying, I don't know. Okay, and then last but not least, this terrible supervisor regularly asks her employee personal questions, mocks him in meetings, sends emails at weird hours, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond. Could that be stalking? All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, again, splitting the room, but most folks saying yes, about 70-30. Okay, so thanks for doing that. And a few things might have come up for you thinking through these scenarios. You might have been thinking, again, we don't like any of these, but are they necessarily stalking? You might have wondered, well, what else was going on? Or how did the victim feel about it? Or how many times did this happen? So luckily for you, I will go through the behavioral definition and use these examples in there to explain. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break this down a little bit more, it is a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or a one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's two or more behaviors that make up that pattern. That's true behaviorally and in most state statutes. In a few state statutes, they require 3 or more. But I'd say if you have 2, the third one's coming. But in some states, you need 3 or more to charge. But behaviorally, again, 2 or more incidents that make up that pattern. And those behaviors can be quite varied. And so let's say I'm stalking Mary Kate because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay? So maybe Monday I text her, Tuesday I match, didn't respond, I smash her headlights. Then Wednesday I feel kind of bad about that, so I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? And so stalkers might combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that aren't crimes on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. And so that's confusing because it's not illegal to text somebody or to send flowers or to ring a doorbell or to park on a public street, right? But it is illegal to stalk somebody. And so what I encourage you to do, and I know you're sitting in different, roles here, but when a victim's talking to you about a victimization and or a crime, take a step back and think, is this a standalone incident or is this part of a bigger pattern of behavior? Because a lot of times our stalking cases come in as, for example, property crimes, right? And so who's looking at that and seeing what else is going on? Because if a victim's talking about, who slashed their tires, they may or may not think it's relevant to mention, I know who did this, and they've been sending me weird text messages, and my accounts have been acting weird, and I've been getting weird packages, or whatever it might be. They may or may not think that's relevant because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this incident, but it is relevant because it shows this is a stalking case, right? And so again, pretty much any victim report, I'd be thinking, is this an isolated incident? Is it part of a bigger pattern of behavior? And it's directed at a specific person or persons. So in that first scenario where someone's peering in the women's locker room, that might still be a crime. But if he's looking at whoever happened to be undressing at that moment, that's probably not stalking because stalking is directed at a specific person. That being said, it could totally become stalking, right? Let's say that offender then focuses on one woman in the dressing room and follows her and contacts her. Okay, now we could have a stalking case because now it is directed at a specific person. And now we have 2 things. We have the voyeurism, we have the contact, right? So we need 2 or more. So it could absolutely be part of a stalking case, but that on its own probably wouldn't be because it's directed at a specific person or people. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe an offender stalking, say, their ex-partner. Ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now they're stalking their ex and the ex's new significant other, right? And stalkers are trying to get access and information about their victims. So they're likely to reach out to people in the victim's life. So their friends, family, colleagues, neighbors. A lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case. But behaviorally, we still see that as directed at a specific person because that offender's trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. But that is their target and that is who they're trying to get information and access about. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's what separates stalking from a victimization it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel annoyed, angry, disrespected, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is calling me names at the staff meeting because I didn't respond to her middle of the night email, like, she's terrible and I'm upset, I feel disrespected, this is not okay. I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I'm just like, this is really frustrating to my day. But let's say then I'm driving home, I think I see her car a couple back. She texts me a picture of myself walking my dog and says, why are you doing that instead of working? She emails my partner. I don't know how she got his email. Okay, now I'm scared, right? And so because like, what does she want? What's her end game here? You know, do I have any privacy? How do I get away from this person? And so, you know, harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct or become stalking, but they're a little bit distinct because of that element of fear. And that's important because stalking is typically a higher charge than harassment. Because victims of stalking typically experience a higher risk level than victims of harassment, right? They're at higher risk for other kinds of victimization and violence. And so we want to call it stalking when it's stalking. And so fear of what, right? So in our behavioral definition, it's pretty broad. We are fear for safety or safety of others. So that's really about our physical safety, our bodily safety, or suffer substantial emotional distress. And that's about emotional safety. And I don't mean that in a touchy-feely way, like we all feel good all the time, though of course I wish that for you, right? Emotional distress and fear, we're really talking about the fear of things that can also really alter someone's life, right? So, and recognizing that fears are not always a physical harm. It could be fear of losing custody of your children, of never having a moment alone again, of being watched forever, right? Of, you know, never being able to get ahead at work because this person sabotages you every time by sending, you know, an intimate image to your new supervisor, which is a real stalking case I just read. And so, you know, that sense of that fear of, you know, that emotional distress. And so it can be a different line for different folks. It's not an absolute, you know, here, this is harassment, this is emotional distress, this is stalking. But we're talking about emotional distress. We're really talking about that fear of emotional harm that's significant, where someone's changing their life most likely because of this invasion from the stalker. But fear is tough, right? Fear is very personal. So what's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch this. This is literally a 5-second video, and I want you to think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. So some of you might have felt like the woman in this video, in which case, I'm sorry I did this to you. Someone the other day was like, where was the trigger warning? So I'm sorry if that's you. But my guess is folks on this call who are doing the work every day, who've heard it all, right? Probably this face left here on the screen is resonating a little more with a lot of you, or at least we can understand where this guy's coming from, right? Like, it's this tiny spider, this woman's losing her mind, like, can you calm down? So we can understand why this face is happening. But what if I told you that last year this woman was bit by a spider that looked just like that, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital and almost died? Would we still be making this face at her? Hopefully not, right? Because what I'd give you there, context, information, the backstory, and context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what's scariest to a victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. For example, this was a case, this woman did call the police. She was hysterical. And all she'd say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. You know, they're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem, lady? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out this was a stalking victim who had relocated to get away from the offender, address confidentiality, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see you, unfortunately, because of the webinar format, but typically when I tell that story in person, people go like, ugh, right? Or like, mm-mm. And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear, right? It's really scary when you know the whole story. But if all you see is this artifact of there's coffee in the car, we're like, I wish my car did that. Like, what are you upset about, right? It's really the context that explains it and explains why that's scary and why that's threatening. And so something may be scary to the victim, but not to you as the responder. And so what I encourage you to do is ask victims for more information respectfully, right? Ask them questions like, what message did that send to you? Tell me more about that. What's the story behind that? What do you think might happen next, right? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? So the victim gets roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so lovely, because they don't know about that specific meaning. You know, it's context that makes stalking scary or distressing. And it's also context that makes stalking stalking, because it's the context of what else is going on here? How are these behaviors adding up? And that can criminalize those otherwise non-criminal behaviors. It's not illegal to give someone coffee. It is generally illegal to threaten to kill somebody, right? And so if that's really what that is, it requires a little more explanation. But you know, it's really that context that criminalizes the behavior, as well as how are these adding up over time. The reality is, if a victim is afraid or in distress, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you at first, they probably know something you don't. They probably have a good reason. And we know there's no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. So we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video and see how it plays out. All right, so it's a very silly video, but this happens in our stalking cases all the time, right? We have a victim in a lot of distress, and we have a responder who's saying, I don't know what you're so upset about. It's just a few text messages. It's just, you know, whatever. Who was on point the whole time? It was the victim, right? So again, even if it doesn't make sense at first glance, the victim probably knows something we don't, and we need to get those answers. But is it fear? So often, you know, when a victim is telling you about what's going on with them, they're unlikely to use the word stalking or fear, right? They're not likely to say, hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct directed at me, a specific person, that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear and or suffer substantial emotional distress. I believe you call that stalking victimization, right? If they do, please call me. I'll be like, our awareness month is so good. But they're probably not going to say that. They're going to say something more like, my ex is being creepy. My neighbor's being weird. My boss is making things awkward. And we don't necessarily love to lead with, I feel afraid, just culturally, right? We're more likely to mask that under, I'm concerned, I'm worried, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed. And of course, we know that victims genuinely respond to traumatic events differently, right? You might have some who present as just really angry, who have no affect at all, who are laughing about the whole thing, who just seem sad. It doesn't mean that it's not fear and that it's not stalking. And like you all mentioned earlier, we see a lot of minimization from our victims. So for example, this law enforcement officer shared this story with me when I was doing a training one time. They were the regular point of contact for a stalking victim, and they called to check in, and the victim was in a really good mood. And the victim said, today's a great day. He's only driven by my house 10 times. And the officer was like, what do you mean it's a great day? That's ridiculous. It's 9 in the morning. That's a nightmare. And the victim said, oh, but usually by this point, he's driven by like 25 times. So I think it's going to be a low-key day. And so it's not this victim's unreasonable, right? But she is responding to repeated trauma by normalizing, which to most people would be really scary. And that's why behaviorally that reasonable person standard is really helpful, because if a victim's saying, oh no, it's totally fine, you kind of take a step back and be like, is it? Would most people feel totally fine about that in that same situation, right? And that can be really helpful. Another way to assess for fear is ask the victim what they've changed as a result of the stalking behavior. Because I've had victims say, I'm not afraid of them, but I stopped using social media and I changed my routes to and from school, and I left their picture with front desk security, you know, just in case. Okay, so to me, it's not to call that victim out or anything, but those are things you do when someone's sort of annoying you. To me, that indicates a higher level of fear or distress that you are making changes in your life to get away from this offender, right? And so ask your victim about those accommodations, and really that's evidence of their fear or distress. Have they changed their accounts, numbers, or settings? They changed their phone number. They used to have the location on, but now they don't. They stopped using certain applications. They blocked the person. Have they spent money on safety devices or accommodations? Whether that's, increased security or privacy measures, like I changed the locks, I purchased a Ring doorbell so I can see who comes to my house. Or things like, I was going home, but I saw them park outside my apartment. So then I stayed at a motel and here's the receipt. As well as financial impacts on damaged property, because it's a little more concrete to show most of us understand why spending a bunch of money on something that we didn't want to spend it on is emotionally distressing, right? And so, okay, there's been employment consequences. I kept having to go to court or deal with this property damage, so I couldn't get a job and I lost these wages. It could be identity theft, they hacked into my accounts, or just they smashed my windshield, I had to get it fixed, right? So those are all different changes. And also witnesses and what they say, right? You might have, a daycare that's saying, oh, this person never used to call, but now they keep calling and saying, make sure I'm the only one who picks up my kids, right? And, they left a picture of this person and said, call me if you ever see them. And, that kind of, safety behavior is indicating a level of fear or emotional distress. So before I move on to prevalence and behavior, I saw a couple questions about a reasonable person standard. That is generally a legal term, but we use it in the behavioral definition as well, because it really just means someone in the same situation with the same background relatively. So it's not saying, would it be reasonable for any woman to scream at a spider? We're like, no, not really. Would it make sense for any woman with the history of that medical situation to scream at a spider? Yeah, we could see that's kind of fair, right? And so that's really what we're talking about with reasonable person standard, right? How would a reasonable person act in that same situation? And again, it can be helpful in cases where a victim's really minimizing what's going on to kind of take a step back in your evaluation of the victimization to say, is that okay that you are followed constantly and never have a moment to yourself? Or is that not okay, right? You can kind of think about that as well. All right, so prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. In the United States, nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking victimization in their lifetimes. And we know that stalking impacts people of all gender identities, absolutely. This is the best available national data, and this is how it's collected in these binary terms. That's why I'm repeating it to you that way. And this is pretty new data from the CDC that came out this year, February 2022. And so it's showing, and we know this is underreported, right? Just like intimate partner violence, sexual violence. And yet we're still seeing nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experiencing stalking victimization. So if you think about this, this is really very similar in terms of prevalence as intimate partner violence and or sexual violence. And yet for so many folks, for stalking training, there's few, if any, standalone stalking resources, right? There's not the stalking crisis shelter. There's not, there's no stalking hotline that folks can call. And there aren't a lot of national agencies working on addressing stalking. Really, it's SPARC, and we're a project of Equitas, and we're a small staff, right? And so not that we have a chip on our shoulder or anything, but just to say that, if you're primarily working on sexual and or intimate partner violence, that's certainly a lot on your plate already, but there is nowhere else for their stalking victims to go. So it's kind of up to us to include stalking in our responses, because they can't go to the stalking crisis shelter. That's not a thing, right? They really have to enter through those other points. And so it's important that we reach those victims and that we then have the services and training and resources to really help them get what they need. So stalking's high, victimization is prevalent across the board. For our sexual minorities, it's higher than for our heterosexual folks. So especially our lesbian women, gay men, and our bisexual women experience higher rates on average than our heterosexuals. Women are more likely than men to experience stalking, though again, people of all genders experience it. And the majority of victims report that the offender's male. That's regardless of the victim's sexual orientation, they're reporting the offender's male. That's true over 80% of the time for female victims, their offender's male. But it's also true about half the time for male victims. About half the time male victims are saying their offender's male. So what's going on there? Well, some of it might be from same-sex relationships, but some of it's also that target dispersion that I talked about earlier, that say it's an ex-husband stalking an ex-wife, she gets a new boyfriend, now he's stalking the new boyfriend as well. That's not all of men stalking other men, but that is a big piece of it. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So as you see, it's a lot of alleyways, hoodies, lurking. I like this person in the middle left that's wearing like a mask and a hoodie and behind a computer, but did not cover their webcam. So you get the sense of these kind of creepers in the alley, very similar to the myth of the stranger rapist imagery, if you're familiar with that, right? And I'm sure it will not surprise you at all on this call with the work that you do to recognize that this is not accurate, right? That really, no, the majority of the time, victim knows the offender, offender knows the victim. And so again, I expect that you know that already. You're like, duh, Dana, why are you spending time on this? Obviously, victims and offenders actually know each other most of the time. But when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, you know, people are shocked by this because when most people think about stalking, this is what they're thinking of. They're thinking about a stranger, random person in the alleyway. That's the image of a stalker that our general public has in mind. Or they're thinking of an obsessed fan stalking a celebrity. So, you know, Taylor Swift, the Kardashians, someone like that who imagines they have a relationship with that person perhaps, or is obsessed with that person. Or they might be imagining kind of a secret admirer who's sending, like, we don't know who the stalker is, but they're sending us like ransom style notes made out of magazines because they're still buying magazines for some reason. Okay, so all those things can happen, right? But it's not usually what's going on. And so because this is the public conception of stalking, you often have victims saying things like, oh, that's not a stalk. I mean, it's not stalking. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, surprising no one on this call, that is a very likely category of relationship to engage in that stalking behavior, right? So over 40% of the time for female victims, about a third of the time for male victims, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. It's related to intimate partner violence. It's an extension of that power and control. And it's part of that relationship either during and or after. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. But I also want to make the point strongly that if, okay, 30 to 40% we're looking at intimate partner stalkers, that's a big piece of it. But that also means that 60 to 70% of the time, it's not an intimate partner, right? It could be an acquaintance. It may be a stranger, though it's relatively rare. A brief encounter, like someone, oh, I met them at that coffee shop. I think I saw them at a party, a friend of a friend. Could be a family member or a person of authority, like a supervisor, academic advisor, law enforcement officer, someone with some kind of power. And so I encourage you to think about, you know, are you serving all victims of stalking? Because most victims are thinking stalking is strangers, and most service providers are thinking stalking is intimate partners. And we're both only seeing part of the picture and we're going past each other, right? Because the reality is there are lots of different victim and offender relationships. And if you are serving them, that's great, but would they know how to find you? Because if I'm being stalked by an acquaintance, let's say it's a neighbor, and there was never a sexual or romantic relationship, it probably wouldn't occur to me, the victim, to pick up the phone and call, you know, family crisis services or go to the rape crisis shelter, right? Because that's not what I'm experiencing. But that's where people like you are housed. That's where the victim advocates are that can actually help with that safety planning. And so I encourage you to think about your response to stalking, and we have a checklist for just that, so you can be the most popular person at your next staff meeting. And Emma will link this in the chat in a second. But basically just asking a bunch of questions like, hey, is the word stalking on your website? Do you have a clear policy on if victims who are experiencing non-intimate partner stalking can come into shelter, right? Or if not, where do you refer them? Do you have resources like, for example, the stalking brochure that you can order for free on our website so that you have something to hand your victim of stalking, just like you have something hopefully to hand your victim of, you know, sexual violence or dating violence? Do you participate in National Stalking Awareness Month? Is your staff trained on stalking? Do they screen for stalking, right? So really just a bunch of, hey, let's evaluate. And then of course we have resources to help you build that in. So stalking behaviors. There are so many stalking behaviors, and so we don't have time to list them all, or we'd be here forever. I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are very persistent and creative criminals, right? People often tell me their most bizarre, disturbing cases are their stalking cases because definitionally, it is about going out of your way just to scare somebody else, right? So like I read a case where an offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her house. Like that's a stalking case. These like, oh, why? Those are stalking cases, right? And so because stalkers are creative, we also have to be creative in identifying the variety of behaviors that a stalker might be engaging in. And so when someone says this, I know it sounds crazy, but that's an indicator this could be a stalking case. And I'll tell you why. So one really common stalking behavior is to break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign that they were there. So maybe they leave a can of soda, that's the brand the victim knows that the offender drinks. Or they move a lamp. They one time argued about where it should go. Or they leave the TV on a channel they used to watch together. And so they get, let's say, home. They know that offender's been there. But they're like, what am I going to do? Call the police and say someone moved a lamp? I'm going to sound crazy, right? And they know, and offenders know that. That's why they engage in that behavior. And so it's hard to prove. It's contextual in nature. It's really threatening, but only if you know the backstory, right? So if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that could be a stalking case. And by the way, the new CDC data, showed 1 in 5 victims reported that exact victimization, an offender breaking into vehicle or residence and leaving some sign that they were there, right? And so stalkers can engage in a wide variety of behaviors. And often when people think stalking, they think surveillance. And you get that imagery of like the binoculars or a camera. We've heard a lot about air tags in the news lately. And surveillance is a big part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, because anything scary that isn't the first thing that happened could be part of a stalking case. And so this is, I think, a really helpful framework by this wonderful researcher, TK Logan, that categorizes sort of the big sort of buckets of stalking behavior that we're likely to see. And these overlap and intersect, and that's fine, but it's to kind of broaden our thinking about what a stalker might be engaging in. And so I'm going to go over what each of these are and a few examples of each, and feel free to share in the chat if you've seen any of these in your work. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is the offender tracking, watching, monitoring, gathering information about that victim? That could be using technology, so planting that GPS vehicle, hacking into a smart device where now, maybe the victim got a Ring doorbell and now the offender hacked into that. So now they're watching who's coming and going, right? But most, not all, but most stalkers who stalk through technology are also stalking in person. So good old fashioned showing up, following around the neighborhood in a car, driving by the home, and also proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying stalking through other people. And so most victims and offenders know each other, and so they might have shared social networks. And so sometimes those third parties know they're helping a stalker, right? You might have an offender say, hey, go check up on this victim for me and report back. Or sometimes those third parties have no idea they're helping a stalker. And it's that mutual friend and someone saying, hey, are they going home for winter break? Or do you know when or calling the supervisor, when's their shift over? Because I just need to hand them something, right? And so those kind of third party stalking can happen through technology as well. Maybe the victims block the offender on social media, but they have mutual friends. And so some pictures still pop up that show that mutual friend of the victim, right? And so that proxy stalking really can't be overstated, because so often that's what's happening when our offenders are getting information. Again, either through technology, in person, or most likely some combination of both. So that's surveillance. Our next category is life invasion, which is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there. So the victim's just trying to get through their day, and there's a stalker saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, right? And so we see that most commonly through unwanted contact, right? At home, at work, wherever the person is. Most of us have smartphones, and so it's across applications, right? There's notifications on WhatsApp, we have a text message, we have email, they're on Facebook, they're on LinkedIn, we have comments on our Instagram, we know it's the offender. You sit down to do your job and they got your work email too, right? So just that across platforms, across locations, contact. It could be just showing up, right? And we see a lot of that since when do you go to our kid's soccer game, right? Since when do you go to this church? But they're just showing up places that the victim is likely to be. Phone calls, including hangups, property invasion, I already talked about, that just breaking into someone's home, leaving some sign they were there. Public humiliation or spreading rumors, which I'll talk about more in a second, or harassing others close to the victim. And so many victims say, hey, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that my mom is saying that the offender's asking about me, now that they're trying to, invite themselves to outings with my friends or colleagues, that's really not okay, right? And so often it's through those other folks. Now with that public humiliation and spreading rumors, if you remember way back when I started talking, we had those 3 scenarios. And the middle one was an offender spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Is that stalking, yes or no? And you all were split. I'd say of the 3 scenarios, that's the most likely to be stalking, because that kind of rumor spreading and humiliation is often part of a stalking case. And it can be really combined categories and be really invasive as well as interfering. And you may be thinking like, well, people gossip, that's not necessarily stalking, and you're right. But we see some really intentional and sabotaging kind of public humiliation and rumor spreading. For example, I recently read a case where an offender Photoshop nude images, pornographic images of the victim onto someone engaging in sexual acts, wrote a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually, as well as her actual phone number, made a flyer, distributed it to everyone in her workplace and apartment building. Okay, so obviously that's beyond, oh, people gossip, right? That's humiliating and invasive in a lot of ways. And it's really sabotaging that victim, because they're trying to get through their day and have a normal social life, work life. They don't know who has seen this, what they're thinking about them. They're getting unsolicited contact of the sexual nature. It's interfering in their day, right? And so we see that, as well as that discrediting the victim. So calling CPS on the victim, or and even a noise complaint, or saying, oh no, they're the one stalking me. And so by the time it goes to a judge, the judge is like, it seems like everyone needs to calm down, when really it's the offender who's been manipulating the situation. So we do see that kind of rumor spreading and humiliation. His category is intimidation. Hopefully you can see how everything I mentioned would be intimidating. We do see those threats as well, either direct or often indirect, right? But that I will harm you, I'll do this to you. Property damage or symbolic violence, like a crushed can. Forced confrontations, they're just standing in the hall, they won't leave. They're standing in front of my vehicle, I can't leave the house. Threats to harm oneself, that's really scary for a victim. Or threats to the victim about harming others, pets, family, friends, colleagues, new partners, anybody. And so again, everything I'm saying here can be intimidating, but because stalking is about fear, we often have to do a little more explaining. Why is that intimidating? The cup of coffee is intimidating. What's it really saying? I found you, I can get to you, especially if there's violence in the past, right? I'd say that's really threatening, but again, more contextual, right? There's that intimidation, and then interference through sabotage or attack. So this is really what is changing as a result of the stalker's behavior. What is the victim losing or afraid of losing because of that interference from the stalker? And so with that spreading rumors, it could be, again, that sabotage, right? They're setting me up to fail in a variety of ways. Socially, at work, maybe they're just calling and saying, guess who gave me terrible customer service? Or spreading rumors in the workplace. Could be financial sabotage, like hacking into accounts, right? Changing things around in the bank account. Custody interference, keeping them from leaving, right? Just standing outside the door. Road rage, we see that tailgating or driving someone off the road. Attacking those close to the victim. Of course, actually attacking the victim, that interferes with their bodily health and safety, as well as property damage, very tangible interference, right? Slash my tire, I can't get to work, that interferes with my day. And so I encourage you to, when you're identifying, is there stalking, ask about all of these behaviors. And so typically if you just ask, hey, are you experiencing stalking? the person's going to say, no, that's not stalking. But if you break it down into some of these more specific behaviors, you're likely to get more information. So ask, have they ever tracked, followed, or monitored you in any way? Have they invaded your life or privacy by initiating unwanted contact? Have they directly interfered with your life? Have they intimidated or scared you, right? And that's where you might get more information. Oh, well, they did follow me around in a car this one afternoon and it was pretty scary, but it only happened once. But then, yeah, my accounts have been acting weird. I do think it's them. I can't quite prove it. And you might end up getting more information that way. And if they say yes to any of these, did any of this make you feel concerned or afraid for your safety or the safety of others? Did you make significant life changes? Again, this is really helping you assess, how is this changing the victim's life? What is their level of fear or distress? And not only in terms of their physical safety, but also financial and social impact, right? So this doesn't take a super long time and is a great way to assess for that stalking behavior. There's also a complete risk profile available at coercivecontrol.org. I'm sorry, risk assessment. That's great. I really can't recommend it highly enough. And it is specific to stalking. So if you use like the LAP or Mosaic, those are great, but they don't really focus on stalking behavior. This is a risk assessment specific to stalking and harassment. It's free, it's online. It's too long for your responding officer, but it takes like 15 minutes. It creates a succinct narrative report that helps tell the story, and it evaluates 14 risk factors and will tell you, hey, based on the information you gave us, you have a low, medium, high risk. It also generates some safety planning suggestions that can be a good starting point when working with a victim advocate. So we have a recorded webinar of us just going through this with a sample case. If you want to see it before you use it, you can also go to the website coercivecontrol.org and click around and click, oh, I'm just testing this out, and go through it. But I really recommend it highly for making sure that you are thoroughly evaluating what that victim's case and getting a sense of all the different behaviors that might be happening to best establish their risk profile. We also have resources to help you identify stalking. So, and some of these are longer or shorter, right? But for our, could this be a stalking case? Identifying stalking on calls for service. So that helps educate law enforcement on, hey, here's what people might say when what they're really saying is it's stalking. And, here's some different behaviors to ask about. We have a checklist for corrections on different behaviors so that they can work that into their supervision terms. Same for victim services. Those questions I just had, we have a handout with them. So I hope that you'll check these out and share with other folks in your multidisciplinary response to make sure that people really are assessing for and identifying stalking when it happens, because it's so common and so often goes not identified. And because there's a lot of potential stalking behaviors, there's also a lot of potential other crimes that might be committed in the course of a stalker's course of conduct, right? And so again, our stalking cases often come in as something like a property crime or vandalism, identity theft, computer crimes, and check your state statutes, your criminal codes. I know, like, I do a lot of trainings in Virginia, and I could be misremembering the exact phrasing, but it's something like calling with intent to annoy is a crime, right? And so, the reason I bring this up is because what we tell law enforcement is, if you can't charge stalking, charge something ideally. And from the victim services end, make sure you're documenting and saving evidence for everything, even these minor, things, because often the victims will complain and say, they said they couldn't do anything until someone tried to hurt me. And that's not true. There's plenty of nonviolent crimes in your code, right? Even if it's voyeurism or something like that. And you want to charge and document and report what you can, because you're helping to build that course of conduct, right? Because if on day one you have voyeurism and on day two you have that calling with intent to annoy, I know I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you now have a stalking case. You have 2 or more behaviors that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or distress. But if we ignored that voyeurism because we're like, yeah, whatever, it's a misdemeanor, man. Now we don't have a stalking case. We're starting with 1 instead of 2. And so again, it's really important to, if you can't charge stalking, charge something, when that's what the victim wants, and to build that course of conduct, right, with those big and little things, because they add up, but they only add up if we're writing them all down and making the list. So both stalkers engage in multiple of these behaviors, right? They're not just showing up, they're not just texting, they're doing a variety of things. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victim at least once a week, many pursue daily. And the average duration of a stalking case, this really shocked me when I learned this, not the high end, the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. And 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so look, a stalking case can last from an afternoon to a lifetime, right? There's a huge variety. But with that average duration being 2 years, we know that stalkers often have a lot of time to change their behavior. And so what that means is when you're safety planning with the stalking victim, no, you can't read the future, but as much as possible, I encourage you to not focus on what's already happened, but what might happen next. Because the offender is probably not going to stay with that previous behavior. They're likely to change it and do different things to try to access that victim. So ask the victim about what access or information does this offender have about you. Let them know, hey, here are common stalking behaviors. What do you think this offender might do next? How do you think they might respond? And be as predictive as realistically possible, right? Because they are likely to change those behaviors. So co-victimizations. Stalking often intersects with other victimizations and or crimes. I already mentioned intimate partner violence briefly because, like I said, about 30 to 40% of cases are intimate partner violence related, and that the offender is a current or former intimate partner, right? So we know that's a big chunk. So I want to focus in on that a little more here. So if we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before, of course, this is highlighting the different kinds of tactics that an abuser might use to exert power to control their victim, beyond and or in addition to physical or sexual violence, right? And the reason I show you this is because often if I do hear stalking mentioned, people talk about it like this. They'll say, okay, it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and from the day the victim left, that abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely, right? But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, the abuser is texting constantly, calling all the time, showing up at work, showing up at school, demanding check-ins, putting a GPS on the car, excuse me, that's stalking, right? It's abuse, it's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse, and it's stalking. It's both. It can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. About half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well, right? And we want to know that. We want to know when they're stalking at any point in that intimate partner violence relationship, because on average, while all stalkers can be dangerous, intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest threats to their victims, but they're most likely to be threatening and violent. So in the chat, if you can tell me why. Why would an intimate partner stalker be more threatening and violent than, say, a casual acquaintance or a stranger? Why would that be? I'll give you a second to chat. And again, remembering that this is opposite of what most victims think, right? Most victims are they're not most afraid, but the assumption is that they'll be most afraid when there's that stranger stalker. So they have more information, they have full access, the knowledge of routines and personal details. It's personal. Absolutely. I think you're all exactly nailing that, right? It's that access, and that access can be very practical for a stalker. So they might know your password, or they know your security questions. They know your mom's phone number, so they can call her and say, I can't reach this person, I'm so worried, where is she, right? And so they have that kind of access and information. And that information could be, again, very practical to stalk, like someone's password, as well as that personal, right? That personal piece, because stalking is about uniquely scaring somebody. And so they also know that victim's unique phobia, or the thing that will really upset that victim, right? That'll really get under their skin. And they're going to misuse that information now to scare the victim, right? So yeah, that access, that information, their shared social networks, absolutely. As well as that power and control extension, right? So that's why on average, the closer someone is or was to the victim, the more likely they are to be threatening and violent. Now, again, all stalkers can be dangerous, right? Absolutely. And when you're looking at our acquaintance stalkers, acquaintance is a pretty big category here. So if it's an acquaintance that's like, oh, that was my old housemate, and we were best friends, and we traveled together and lived together, and then we had this big falling out, and now they're stalking me, I would put that as closer to an intimate partner level of threat than a stranger, right? Because of the access to information. So of course you want to evaluate each case individually, but generally the closer someone is or was, the more access to information they have, the more personal it is, the more dangerous that they are. And you know, victims, there's studies showing victims are often the most afraid when the offender is that intimate partner, but they don't call because in their mind, an offender is that shadowy stranger. And so they don't identify what's going on as stalking behavior, right? And so, for example, there's a victim who shared with me, she was stalked twice, totally unrelated episodes. And one time it was an ex-husband, and the other time it was a homeless man with mental health issues. And guess which one got the better response, right? When she was really afraid for her life was when her ex-husband was stalking her. But when police got involved and there was no problem getting the order and security and all those things, was for that the homeless man in her neighborhood. And so again, our perceptions of what stalking is can really color reporting and response, right? But we want to remember that information and access. So intimate partner stalkers are more likely to physically approach the victim in person, be interfering, insulting, and threatening, use weapons to threaten or harm, have their behaviors escalate quickly. And while the recidivism rate is high across the board for stalkers, it's a Also, I thought this was interesting that within domestic violence, I think when we identify stalking, it can be easy for folks to say, okay, so there was technically stalking too, but it's really about the violence. And of course, I'm not trying to in any way minimize the harm of domestic violence. But if this study found that women were more than 3 times more likely to try to leave a relationship when there's intimate partner stalking, that was a more powerful indicator than firearms and prior abuse history. And so I'm certainly not saying any kind of victimization is more or less traumatic than any other, but for those who might be thinking like, well, you know, okay, so there's technically stalking, but it's really about the abuse, our victims are telling us something different, that intimate partner stalking is traumatic even among other traumatic victimizations. You know, you might have heard the statistic that it takes an average of 7 times for a victim to leave an abuser. Well, what's that about? Not always, but often it's about stalking, right? That continued extension of power and control. And so unsurprisingly, our victims of intimate partner stalking have more separation attempts on average than our victims of intimate partner violence who don't experience stalking. Another study reinforcing this was a study of women with protective orders. So all the women have been abused, all of them have protective orders. Some of them were abused and stalked. For the women abused and stalked, they experienced higher rates of all of this across the board, everything listed here, from verbal abuse to physical violence, sexual violence, threats with a weapon, being beat up, attack with a weapon, and injury. When there was abuse and stalking, higher rates of all of these. Now, I'm not saying that stalking causes these other victimizations, but I am saying it's an indicator that when you see stalking in an intimate partner violence case, that should be a big red flag that, hey, this case might be especially urgent, that this victim is probably experiencing other kinds of victimization as well. If we just call it emotional or digital abuse, we miss that chance to really have the urgency needed and a safety plan appropriately with that victim. And like I said earlier today, that homicide connection, right? Another study showing this, the 3-fold increase in risk of intimate partner homicide when there's partner perpetrated stalking, one of the top 10 lethality risks. Stalking can also intersect with sexual violence a few different ways. The stalker might be planning to sexually assault the victim. So if an offender is researching a potential victim, right, assessing who seems vulnerable and how do I access them, right, that can include stalking behavior. Or their threats might be of a sexual nature, right? They might be threatening to be sexually violent. They might try to get someone else to assault the victim. I'll talk about that more in a second. They might actually assault the victim. That could be part of their course of conduct, right? Or sometimes the stalking actually happens with sexual violence and there's contact after, right? So there's the sexual violence and then the trauma is extended through the offender intimidating them, saying, hey, don't tell anyone, or I'm going to watch you and see who you tell. Or for example, there was a case where a victim was sexually assaulted with an object and then the offender kept mailing the victim that object, right? And so that kind of stalking after the assault. Now, in terms of that third-party stalking, trying to get someone else to assault the victim, I think this is one of the more straightforward. It was a former Marine, and he essentially solicited his ex-girlfriend's rape and assault on Craigslist. So if you've used Craigslist, you know that it doesn't really verify your identity. You just kind of go online. And so what he did was impersonated the victim and said, hey, I have this violent rape fantasy. Here's what I'm looking for. If I yell and scream, that's part of it. Here's where I live, and here's what I look like. And unfortunately, because we live in a terrible world, someone did respond to that ad and assault that woman. The only good news here is that both offenders were held accountable, both the actual rapist as well as the ex who facilitated the sexual violence. And when most people see this, they're not like, oh, a stalking case. But really that third party, sending third parties to harass and or directly assault a victim is increasingly part of stalking cases. And this might seem like a really extreme example, but it's quite easy to impersonate someone online. And we see it a lot through dating websites and or social media profiles. Typically, all you need is an email and the name of the person. I'm sorry, and a photo of the person. And so, we see offenders impersonating victims on dating websites, making contact. And if that offender is engaging in surveillance as well, sending third parties to go and sexually harass and or assault those victims. And so, again, would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, absolutely. And even the most narrow stalking statutes typically include fear of sexual assault, sexual violence. And so this is often part of a stalking case and how it can intersect. If you also think about grooming for sexual violence under the lens of stalking, right? That offenders are, and this is not all kinds of sexually violent offenders, but there are certain perpetrators, those repeat rapists who have this kind of MO. So they're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. That could be an upperclassman looking for, say, a freshman woman who doesn't seem to have a lot of drinking or partying experience. It could be an adult predator looking for a child from a marginalized community who seems neglected. They're going to establish relationships, whether that's saying, hey, you're so mature for your age, you seem really cool, or I understand you so much better than your parents do, I want to pay attention to you. If they haven't yet, they're going to meet in person and isolate the victim. So that could be come to this party, isolate them, apply them with alcohol, isolate them, commit the assault and coerce them into those sexual acts. Or it could be that come over for some pictures, we're going to the basement, and then contact after, right? Either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two. And so this kind of grooming behavior and repeat. And so when you think about grooming through the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yeah. Is it directed at a specific person? Yes, they're choosing these targets intentionally based on their perceived vulnerability. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Yeah, most of us are afraid of sexual violence, and that's quite reasonable, right? And you might be thinking, but when though? Because, if you talk to, say, that freshman woman, she might say, well, I wasn't scared on day one when he told me I was so mature for my age, right? I was flattered. But there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So if a victim's looking back at the course of conduct and saying, okay, I wasn't scared day one, but now I'm looking back and realize that our entire relationship was a setup for my sexual assault, and it all started with that text message or that time they waited for me outside of class, that could still be a stalking case, right? And so, consider that grooming and that stalking behavior. There's also just an intersection in terms of occurrence, right? About a third of women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And so look, we tend to be focused on domestic or sexual violence, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those are major prevalent issues that require a lot of attention and capacity. But there's very few folks whose primary lens is on stalking. And so it kind of has to be all of us. Ask survivors about those co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivors about intimate partner and sexual violence, but also ask your victims that are primarily presenting as sexual violence or domestic violence victims about stalking victimization, because so often it is missed. And so hopefully some of the tools we provided can help you to do that without adding too much work. And so I know I keep saying, name stalking, you got to call it stalking. And you might be like, okay, I get that you're the stalking lady, so like you care that I call it stalking, but like, why does it matter? You know, I'm helping victims, I'm safety planning appropriately. Does it matter what I call the victimization? And unsurprisingly, I will argue it does matter, and here's why. Some of it's for those charging and prosecution options. Most prosecutors like having a menu of charges, right, to choose from. So if stalking can be on there, great, let's add it on there. And also, it can be a very strategic charge, especially in intimate partner violence or sexual violence case. And I'll tell you why. Because if they're charging, say, a domestic assault or battery, you know, the court's going to try to limit you to that 10 minutes of the alleged violence, right? If you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. Every incident in that course of conduct is now part of the case. And so those details, like that carving the name in the tree, cup of coffee in the car, flowers the day I kill you, haunts me, haunts you, haunts judges and juries as well. And again, paints a fuller picture of how terrible this offender is beyond or in addition to that potential violence, right? Also, safety planning. Stalking is its own victimization. It requires its own safety planning. When you're stalking, you should be thinking, okay, increased risk for these other victimizations, and I'm going to think about surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation. I'm going to think about what kind of access or information does the offender have about the victim, what might they do next, and really be thinking about that in terms of their elevated risk, as well as the different options for safety planning. If we just call it digital abuse or emotional abuse, we miss that kind of call to urgency that stalking should really be making of us. And victim empowerment, even if victims like, I'm not gonna do any of that, okay? Like, I don't wanna make a safety plan, I don't wanna call law enforcement, even just being able to articulate, I'm experiencing stalking, and that's a real thing, instead of my ex is being creepy, right? Be able to Google stalking victim and get some results and see they're not alone, even that can go a long way. So for all those reasons and more, I think it is really important to name stalking. Thing is, I hear the word stalking all the time used incorrectly. So you might have heard or said something like this, like, oh my God, I'm totally stalking your vacation pics on Insta. And yes, of course, you can use social media to engage in stalking behavior, but that's not really what's happening in this conversation, right? As far as we know. And I hear this all the time, right? Oh my God, I ran into you again. I'm not stalking you, or like I was stalking your pictures, right? And I'm not saying the casual use of the word stalking causes stalking, but it does kind of help contribute to that minimization that we talked about earlier, right? Because it gives people a fake sense that they know what stalking is and it's not that big a deal, when actually most people don't know what stalking is and it is kind of a big deal. And we know that most victims and survivors, they tell a friend or family member first. So how does that person react? Do they say, you know, oh man, that sounds really scary, let's get you some help, stalking's a crime? Or do they say, okay, but is it stalking or is it like stalking? Right? Because that minimization can have a huge chilling effect on if a victim continues to seek services or help. And I'd argue it's a bit unique to this crime at this point, right? No one's like, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson. Like, that's not a thing. If you tell your friend there was arson at my apartment, they're going to be like, oh my God, there's arson? You got to call the police. But if you tell your friend, I think it might be stalking, you're likely to get this kind of like, but is it though? And I think that impacts victims in their reporting. It impacts their informal support, those friends and family members. And it impacts us as responders as well, where it's like, oh, we hear that all the time. It's not a big deal. Or is it though? We also see it normalized in our media quite a bit, where stalking's shown a variety of ways. It's shown as romantic, where our usually male protagonists get the girl by being extremely persistent and grand gestures, and they're showing up and they're sending flowers and they're at the apartment and they're at the school and they're, you know, doing all these different things. And I've seen that framed as, you know, lack of consent, which it is, but it's also stalking behavior. But it's not just in our romantic films, it's also in our comedies and sitcoms and our children's shows quite a bit. It's really a common trope, that character that doesn't understand boundaries, that just keeps popping up again, and here they are again, and it's played for laughs, right? Like, SpongeBob does not respect Squidward's boundaries, right? He's always showing up in his house. And so, you know, that sense that there's no harm there, it's just funny. Or it's shown as heroic, like our superhero movies, where you have, you know, Spider-Man's got to watch over the city. He's got to watch Mary Jane so he can swoop in and save her. And what do our abusers say? They say, well, I trust you, I don't trust the people around you. That's why I have to keep an eye on you so I can protect you, right? So that exact same thing, justifying that surveillance. Or it's shown as edgy and sexy, like in shows like You, where it's like, ooh, this really went there. It's like 1 in 3 women are going there without wanting to. So it's really not that edgy. And we do have discussion guides on the show You that have been really popular on campuses. If you ever want to watch do that program for public awareness. And I'm not like it's the media's fault that they're stalking. That's not my point. But we do have this cumulative effect of, misrepresenting stalking that's kind of miseducating people, and not a lot of real information on stalking that's happening to combat that, right? So this, along with that casual usage, can really normalize and minimize the harm that real stalking causes. And I think, again, can affect victims, informal supports, and those service providers and criminal justice folks. And I think that media literacy is a really fun way to have that conversation. And so we have resources, again, for public awareness to be looking at media and critiquing it that way. So with a few minutes left, then I'll stick around for questions. I see a few came in on the Q&A. So just very big picture on responding to victims. Now we need to recognize victims cope with stalking different ways. All of these are valid human responses, but some might be more or less helpful. So some move against the stalker. So it's, oh, you're stalking me? Great, I'm taking you to jail. Like that is all I'm doing. I'm going to call police right now. You're going down, you're not getting away with this, right? Or you have other victims who do the opposite, move inward. I don't want to cause a problem. I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to put anyone at risk. So they become very isolated, right? And just kind of don't tell anybody and stay alone. You have others move away, so that's relocating, but also doing things like creating distance, right? I change my routes to and from work. I change my phone number. You have others do the opposite, move towards the offender to try to appease them. Okay, you want to talk every day? I'll call you once a week, right? To kind of try to negotiate that. And then you have some who move outward, who move to folks like you who can help them, right? And that's great. But by the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things. And so it's helpful to ask what they've already done to get a sense of what's worked and what hasn't, and meet them where they are. And also to recognize that while I'm not judging any of these responses, they're all very valid, some might be more or less helpful in general for dealing with a stalker. So one I want to address is that moving away behavior. And often this is told to victims, and it's well-intentioned, but not always that helpful, where they'll be told, oh, they're calling you, change your number. They're on social, get off that platform or block them. And so let's play that out for a second. If I'm stalking Mary Kate, and let's say I love to call her, that's my favorite, okay? So I'm calling, and eventually Mary Kate's like, I am so over Dana calling me, I'm gonna change my freaking number. So eventually I call and I get that this number is no longer in service. Am I, the stalker, gonna be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking Mary Kate and become a productive member of society this day? Like, no, I'm already stalking Mary Kate. I know where she works. I know where she lives. I know her email. I'm going to find another way to her. And I might actually escalate my behavior because how dare she? That was my favorite way to stalk her and she took it away from me. So this isn't to say that victims should never take those steps. That might absolutely be what the victim wants to do and or in their best interest, but it's not this obvious low-hanging fruit that always works, right? From a criminal justice perspective, it's helpful because it shows that resistance and persistence. Okay, Mary Kate changed her number, Dana found the new one. Mary Kate blocked Dana on Facebook, she started contacting her on Instagram, right? It shows that intent, so that's helpful, but did that make the victim safer? Maybe, maybe not, right? And so what you want to do is ask the victim how they think the offender will react. Some might say, yeah, that'll send a clear message, that's what I want. And some might say it'll make them angry, it'll escalate the behavior, right? And so ask them. One piece of that move away advice that is generally good is to cease contact with the offender. And that's because offenders see any contact as a win. So if they call 100 times and the victim picks up the phone and says, stop it, I hate you, tomorrow they're calling 101 times. That being said, the disengagement is not always possible or realistic. And so, for example, there was a case and it came out that the victim had called the offender at 2 in the morning, they talked for hours. And so it was in court and the defense is like, well, how scared can this victim be? If she's so scared, why would she call him, right? And so we asked the victim and the victim said, yeah, I heard him. I called him because I knew he got off work at the bar. I could hear him get in his car, drive home and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, wake my kids up again. right? So that moving towards the offender to take the temperature of the situation can sometimes absolutely be in the victim's best interest. And so you want to do both: advise disengagement, recommend no contact because of that reinforcement, and recognize victims are doing their best to keep themselves safe. And for some victims, that includes ongoing contact. That might be a safety strategy. So if there are hard and fast rules in your jurisdiction, like a no contact or protective order will be dropped if they reach out to the offender, make sure the victim knows that, right? But it's not like a bad thing they did. Make sure you have open dialogue and can safety plan around it. And I also think that, some education around this is important, because if you look at like the bottom of the screen, you have victims getting something like this all the time. Getting messages like this all the time. You can imagine the temptation to respond and say, "Stop it, I hate you," is quite strong. It doesn't mean that victim's not afraid or, oh, they were really stalking each other, right? So thinking about that and doing some education on that, I think, is important too. We often tell victims to document, but we don't always tell them how. And so this is a helpful, very succinct, free on our website, English and Spanish. We have a campus version as well. Date, time, what happened, where did it happen? A lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases, and most victims don't understand jurisdiction. Was it on campus, off campus, this county, that other county, across state lines? If it was online, what platform? Because getting evidence from Facebook is different than Snapchat, is different than text message, right? And so we want to know that. If they were witnesses, if evidence attached, great, let's see that, screenshots, photos, videos. And if they made a report to anyone, who was it? Because they might be reporting, again, they don't understand jurisdiction, but even if they're calling the same law enforcement office every time, they might have a different responding officer every time. And so when that person gets the call about the cup of coffee, they don't understand the urgency. And victims often complain, they feel like every time I call, it's like the first time. And so these incidents add up, right? But they only add up if we do the math. And so something like this, along with that SHARP assessment I mentioned earlier, can really, really help to keep track of those incidents and to put the newest thing in context of everything else that's happened. Of course, what we need more than all is much easier said than done, which is that coordination. Because the truth is, our system is not built for stalking cases. It's built to be incident-based. We respond to an incident, we move on. And that's just not what stalking is. It's a multi-incident, highly contextual, sometimes years long, across jurisdiction kind of situation that requires more intensive investigation and or safety planning, right? And so usually when I do read these cases of violence or homicide after stalking, it's not like one person just did a bad job. It's not like, oh yeah, that one officer should have called it in. Usually it's really a system failure. And these cases fall through the cracks. And so we really need everyone working together on this, right? We need our awareness educators to make sure that our general public knows what stalking is, that victims identify it when it's happening to them or a friend, that when their friend tells them, they say the right thing and get them to victim services, that our victim service providers identify it as well and safety plan appropriately and recognize though it's increased risks. We need our law enforcement to charge it. We need our prosecutors to pick up those charges and argue it effectively. We need our courts to have appropriate sentencing, and our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to hold those offenders accountable and keep those victims safe. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And the reality is there's no one whose job it is to do that for stalking victims. And so it kind of has to be you in whatever role you play. After this 90 minutes, you know more about stalking than most people in our field. That is the reality of the situation. So being that advocate who says, hey, I get not everyone understands this, but I see the urgency here, because that's what I see again and again, a lack of urgency in stalking cases. And stalking victims really needing someone to elevate that urgency for everyone and to help connect the dots. A few resources to help you do so. And then, like I said, of course, understanding if folks have to go right at the half hour, but I will stick around for questions. We are a project of Equitas, the prosecutor's resource on violence against women. So free 24/7 technical assistance, could do a deep dive in your statute, talk about admitting digital evidence, anything legal stalking. There's no stalking hotline, but the closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. So if you're ever sharing like the RAIN hotline, the DV hotline, make sure you share Victim Connect as well. They're going to connect to local, typically rape crisis or domestic violence service providers, even if the stalking is not related to those, right? So you want to explain that. Please don't refer victims to SPARC, because we don't do direct services. We'll just have to be nice and send them back to Victim Connect. And so it kind of does disservice to everyone. January is National Stalking Awareness Month. Doesn't always get the same level of love as October or April, but we can change that, right? And we house all the resources on our website. We have daily social media posts, pre-written newsletter blurbs you can just copy and paste, and a bunch of activities and ideas. So I hope that you'll start gearing up for that in January. We have these that you can order for free from us, these brochures, posters. And while no, having this in your office doesn't solve stalking, just having the word stalking when a victim's waiting to be seen might trigger, yeah, maybe it is stalking, right? Making sure you have something to hand that victim of stalking, right, is really important. So you can order these from us to do that. Oops. And of course, everyone's favorite website, you know it, you love it. Emma's been sharing specific links, but everything she shared is on our website. Practitioner guides by discipline, training modules, victim resources, and webinars like this one, and this exact one will be posted up there, assuming the recording went okay. We're also on social, and I hope that you'll follow us, as well as sign up for our newsletter. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking for all grantees and potential grantees of the Office on Violence Against Women. So if you're thinking, I need everyone to hear this knowledge, can you please come to my organization campus? Probably. Go ahead and request a training through our website. And we'll get back to you when we can. And here's my information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for all of your good work. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, do this, think about that, use this tool, but you're the ones who are holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I totally understand and respect that. So really, thank you for the work that you do, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can help you integrate stalking into your response. So thanks so much. And with that, I'm going to go to the Q&A. Let's see. Okay, someone asked, how does this definition, so this must have been when I was looking at the behavioral definition here, apply to trolling, bullying, and doxing? So for those who aren't familiar, trolling is kind of commenting or contacting somebody in order to aggravate them, right? So to antagonize them. And so bullying, you probably know. Doxing is when someone posts like a location of the victim, so, and encourages third parties to go and harass that victim, right? So this person's wronged me, here's where they live, go mess up their life, right? I would say all of those can be stalking behaviors, right? So we often see stalking facilitated through technology. Doxing can be part of a stalking behavior where you're sending third parties to harass and or stalk that person. And so, and with bullying, I think especially, not only, but especially with our adolescents, you know, the intersection of bullying and stalking, I think is really interesting because the definition of bullying is quite similar. It's that repeated behavior that causes fear, right? And so there's no, you know, clear line there, but I think that integrating stalking into your conversations about bullying, technically for our K through 12 and beyond, as well as our conversations on harassment, right? Is it sexual harassment? Or if someone's afraid of sexual violence, I would argue that's not just harassment, that is stalking, right? And so, you know, all to say, I would say that all of those behaviors, trolling, bullying, and or doxing, could be part of a stalker's course of conduct and can be framed as part of a stalking case. And also that if we're looking at, you know, a doxing incident, what else is going on here? Because that might be a stalking case. So hopefully that answers your question. Someone else asked, how do you prevent stalking? I would tell you if I knew. I think that, you know, there aren't any proven interventions or prevention tools that necessarily address stalking specifically. What I would say though is that as we look at our awareness and prevention programming around related victimizations, so our consent education, our dating abuse and healthy relationships education, what I'd love to see is stalking more integrated, because a lot of the same issues and problematic attitudes and power and control dynamics are part of all of those, right? So if we're talking about consent, let's talk about physical boundaries, absolutely, but let's also talk about boundaries around our privacy and around our time, and, you know, around our communication, right? That should be integrated in there. And same with healthy relationships. If we're talking about emotional abuse, mention stalking and talk about how that can be so invasive to someone, right? And so I think integrating that more is really helpful, as well as just tackling some of, easier said than done, but some of the bigger issues in our society around, stalking often, not always, but often comes down to sense of entitlement, right? This person, I deserve this person's attention. And so how are we addressing some of those attitudes? And how are we teaching healthy communication and boundaries? And also, of course, teaching victims to trust their instincts, right? That if you're uncomfortable with how much someone is contacting you or showing up, you're probably right. There probably is something that's actually inappropriate there. Someone's pushing against a boundary, so honor that. So again, I think that, we have standalone stalking programs and they're great, but I also think just building that into these other programs, some of which that have more research behind them at this point, right, can be really helpful. In terms of, sometimes I see things that are like more self-defense focused, we're going to fight a stalker because we're learning self-defense, or technology safety tips. And look, I think it's great to be mindful of what information you're sharing, because it's not intuitive. It's not intuitive that if you email someone a photo, it could include location information, right? Like, that's not intuitive. So I think absolutely learning and being in control of one's own settings and technology safety is great and helpful to do. But at the same time, victims have a right to technology. They don't have to live private lives if they don't want to. And there's also only so much you can do. Through public data, you can find quite a bit of information. And so, I think that can tend towards, it's a fine line between being empowered and know what you're putting out there and be in control of that. And it can become this kind of victim blaming thing that's like, well, you didn't want them to find you. Why did you ever check in anywhere, right? And so, again, knowing that is helpful and good, but it's up to victims how they use that information. So I hope that's helpful. I don't have like an amazing answer, or else I would have done it already. But I do think it's something we need to address a little bit more. All right, couple more minutes here. Someone asked, any resources specifically targeting campus safety planning? Yeah, if you look at our campus resources, for our safety planning webinars, we do have a few items that are specific to campuses. I think the big differences are just, you have some additional challenges on campuses with that geographic proximity, right? There's a lot of public events that every student's invited to, and there might be like a dining hall, and you need to be guaranteeing that respondents access as well as the complainants access, et cetera. So happy to reach out to you and brainstorm around any of those specific to your campus. But yeah, we have a few resources that address that, but not in a ton of depth. We just got this question, but I'm going to answer it because it's an important one. Do you find that stalkers tend to have mental health issues? Yeah, so it's kind of a common question I get. And a lot of folks assume, well, this must be a mental health issue, right? Like, why would people be doing this? Something's wrong with them. And what's actually, I think, more upsetting is that usually it is not a mental health issue. Usually it is an extension of power and control. That offender is trying to scare that person, and they know exactly what they are doing. That isn't to say there's never co-occurring mental health issues. There can be that co-occurring psychosis. Most of the studies on it show that, and I'm generalizing, but if there's a severe mental health disorder, that offender is more likely to target like a celebrity or stranger. So kind of be delusional, I have a relationship with Taylor Swift, that kind of thing, versus targeting an ex-partner, a partner, or acquaintance. So they're more likely to be on that stranger end of the spectrum. A lot of the studies that look at both they don't really break it down. So it's like, any mental health issue, are they stalking? And it's like, well, we all have depression. We're not all stalking, right? And so that condition may or may not be contributing to the stalking behavior. There are cases where it does, right? Or where offenders are somewhere on the autism spectrum, and they don't understand that what they're doing is scaring or upsetting that other person, right? They're not reading that social cue, they're not understanding it. And in cases like that, what we'd say is you still need to address the behavior, right? So do that, with kindness and with empathy, but you're not doing anyone a favor by saying, well, this person didn't quite understand, so it's fine for them to engage in this criminal / victimizing thing. No, it's not. We still need to address that and intervene. And so, yeah, there are absolutely cases where that's been successful, where, okay, didn't realize I was scaring that person, didn't realize that, etc. But of course, if an offender wants to scare that person, then that intervention is, unless they're afraid of the consequence, which can happen, but, they're unlikely to change that behavior. And so, yeah, again, can be a mental health overlap, but usually not. And when there is, we would say you still need to address the behavior. All right, I know I should probably let y'all go in a sec. I'm just seeing if any other questions are, oh, just a quick one. Someone said, well, they gave us a compliment, so I like that. Your website's incredible. Tons of great, clear, easy to use resources. Thank you. They asked, do you have any requirements for us to report back how we use it, the numbers reached? We don't have any requirements. We love to hear it. So I would love if you would let us know. We use this program. Here's how it went. Here's some tips. Here's a picture of us doing it. Like, here's how many people were reached. I would love, love, love to see that. But I think our priority is really to get the information out there. And that's why it's not, we don't have a paywall. You don't have to sign up. You can just, anyone can download our awareness program from our website, because there's just so few resources on stalking. Our priority is getting it out there, right? But we would love to hear how you use it. So no, you don't have to, but we would like it if you did. Let us know what happened. And I think, all right, I'm over 10 minutes past the time, so I'm gonna stop there. But thank you all so much for your attention, and especially those who stuck with me through this Q&A. I appreciate it. If you have additional questions that were not answered, of course, feel free to contact me here at the at dflightman@stalkingawareness.org. And so, yeah, thank you all so much for your attention and for all of your work. And I hope that you'll be in touch and request further trainings.